Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're diving into a pretty pivotal moment in early American history, Alexander Hamilton and the Proclamation of Neutrality of 1793.
Big stuff.
Yeah, you all sent in a ton of great material for this one. Excerpts, analyses, even some primary documents. We're going to unpack it all, see what we can learn about how this one decision echoed through the nation's foreign policy, really how America sees itself in the world.
It's a fascinating story, really. It gets to the heart of some big questions about what it meant to be a new nation figuring out its place on the world stage.
Exactly, and we're really set the scene for you. Picture this. It's 1793, the French Revolution, right? It's in full swing. Europe.
Exploding.
Basically.
Yeah.
And everyone's looking to the United States, this brand new nation, wondering what sides they're going to take.
Huge pressure for a young government. I mean, France had just helped the U.S. win their independence. Do they return the favor, jump into another war?
Right. You'd think that's where this is going. Loyalty and all.
You'd think. But that's where Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, steps in with a different take entirely.
He's not exactly known for shying away from a good debate either.
Not at all. And from what we can see in these sources, he makes a really strong case for neutrality, which might seem surprising at first glance.
At first glance, totally. But the deeper we go, you see, it's not about just keeping America out of a fight. It was central to his whole vision for the country, right? Like how to build a strong economy when you're a brand new nation.
It's the long game, absolutely. Hamilton, he was all about building a solid economic foundation for the U.S., and to him, that meant staying out of these European conflicts as much as possible. He wanted America to achieve real economic independence, not be beholden to anyone.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's hard to build a strong economy when you're constantly getting dragged into wars, draining resources.
Exactly. And don't forget, trade was essential back then.
Right, like lifeblood.
And war. War would mean choosing sides, potentially alienating major trading partners. Hamilton, he saw that risk, and he wasn't willing to take it.
So it's not just idealism, like war is bad, though. Of course it is. But for Hamilton, it's this calculated move, right?
Very calculated. He's thinking about economic stability, the long-term interests of the nation. He's playing chess, not checkers.
Totally. And it wasn't just about the money either. If we look at the sources, we can see that he was also really worried about the potential for this French Revolution fervor to spill over into American politics, right? Like internal divisions.
Deep divisions already present, actually. The French Revolution, it wasn't just some far-off event. People in America were fired up about it, debating the ideals, the violence, everything.
So this debate was playing out on both sides of the Atlantic.
Exactly. And Hamilton, he recognized that.
Yeah.
He saw how easily these ideological clashes could fracture a young nation, especially one that was still figuring out its own identity. Neutrality to him was a way to prevent these internal tensions from boiling over, kind of like keeping a lid on a pot simmering on the stove.
It's a gamble, though, right? Trying to keep everyone happy, you risk alienating allies to buy some time to let the U.S. grow stronger both economically and politically.
You said it, a gamble with huge stakes. And unsurprisingly, not everyone was thrilled with this neutral stance, especially France. They felt completely betrayed.
Yeah, I bet they weren't too happy about it. After all, they had just helped America in their fight for independence. Now they're facing their own revolution, and America's like, sorry, not our problem.
That's pretty much how it went down, yeah. The French were expecting, even hoping, that the U.S. would jump in on their side. They saw it as a betrayal of the ideals they'd fought for together.
Right, like a slap in the face. It makes you wonder, how did things go so wrong so quickly?
Well, a big part of that is this guy named Citizen Genet.
Oh yeah, Citizen Genet. We have to talk about him because some listeners might not be familiar with why his little visit to the U.S. caused such a stir.
It was more than a little visit. He was a French diplomat sent to the U.S. during the French Revolution. And get this, his goal was basically to drum up support for France. Like, actively recruit Americans to fight for the French cause.
Wait, hold on. America just declared neutrality, and he's over here trying to sign people up for the war effort.
Exactly. That's why it was such a big deal. Genet's actions were seen as a major breach of diplomatic protocol, a direct challenge to American sovereignty. And this is all happening right as the U.S. is trying to establish itself as a legitimate nation on the world stage.
So even though America was trying to stay out of it, the drama followed them home.
Pretty much. And to make matters even more complicated, this whole declaring neutrality thing didn't exactly make all the problems with Great Britain disappear, you know?
Oh, no, not even close.
Yeah.
You're talking about those British forts, right? They were still just hanging out on American soil, even after the Treaty of Paris.
Yeah. Those forts were a constant thorn in the side of the new nation. They were a physical reminder of British interference in American affairs, a daily violation of the treaty that ended the revolution. Imagine fighting a whole war for independence, only to have your former enemy still chilling on your land.
It would be like that annoying roommate who just refuses to move out.
Exactly. Like, didn't we settle this? We're supposed to be neutral here.
Right. And it wasn't just the forts. Didn't the British continue to interfere with American ships, like messing with their trade and stuff, even though the U.S. was officially neutral?
Oh, absolutely. They were stopping American ships, searching them, seizing cargo, and even worse, they were kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. This practice was called impressment, and it was a huge point of contention between the two countries.
Hold on. Kidnapping American sailors, that's completely outrageous.
It was a huge deal, and it really highlights how messy this whole neutrality thing was in practice. Britain was playing both sides, trying to maintain their dominance while limiting American power.
So much for staying out of trouble. It seems like America was caught between a rock and a hard place, facing pressure from both Britain and France.
They were in a tough spot, no doubt about it. And you know what? This whole situation, it really brought to light the deep divisions within American society at the time. Not everyone was on board with Hamilton's approach to neutrality. In fact, his stance ignited a fiery debate that would have a lasting impact on American politics. We're talking about the birth of the two-party system.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. We have Hamilton and the Federalists on one side, and those who oppose the Proclamation of Neutrality on the other.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a simple policy disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies about America's role in the world, about the very nature of government and democracy. You have the Federalists, right? Led by Hamilton, who we were just talking about. They believed in a strong, centralized government, a pragmatic approach to foreign policy. Essentially, they saw neutrality as the best way to protect American interests, allow the nation to develop, gain some economic strength before sticking their necks out too far.
Playing the long game, focusing on domestic stability first.
Exactly. But then on the other side, you have the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. Very different vision, very different. They wanted a more decentralized government. And when it came to foreign policy, they believed in actively supporting democratic movements abroad.
Especially in France.
Especially in France. They saw the French Revolution as this fight for liberty, right? A continuation of the ideals America was founded on. Felt like America had a moral obligation to support it.
So it's almost like these two different visions of what it meant to be a new nation, right? Should America prioritize its own interests?
Or champion these global causes, even at the risk of its own stability?
And that's a debate that, let's be honest, it's still go on today, isn't it?
Absolutely resonates today. But let's get back to 1793. Because even though the Proclamation of Neutrality, it keeps America out of an immediate war with Europe, right? Doesn't mean things with Great Britain are suddenly hunky-dory.
Oh, no, those tensions were still simmering. We've got to talk about impressment. Like, it's bad enough they're interfering with American ships, but kidnapping American sailors, forcing them into the British Navy, that's a whole other level.
A whole other level of not-so-neutral behavior, you could say. And this, my friend, is where the Jay Treaty comes in an attempt to settle all these outstanding grievances between the U.S. and Great Britain.
So, basically, they try to stay neutral and end up with a whole list of new problems they got to deal with.
You got it. And they send John Jay, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, over to London to try to hash things out.
I bet he had some thoughts on the matter. Talk about a tough job.
Right. I mean, after all the concessions they felt they had already made by declaring neutrality, there's a lot riding on this treaty.
The pressure is on. So what happens? Does he come back with a win for the U.S.?
Well, the treaty he negotiates does address some issues, like those British forts we talked about. They were finally supposed to be evacuated, but...
There's always a but.
There is. And this one's a big one. The treaty didn't really address the impressment issue.
Hold up. All that, and they didn't even fix the biggest problem.
Nope. And many people saw the treaty as being way too favorable to Britain. A lot of anger, especially among those who supported France, they saw it as a betrayal. Even caused a rift between Hamilton and Jefferson.
Wait, Hamilton, he supported this treaty?
He did, which, knowing what we know about his personality, probably didn't help with that whole rift situation. But you have to remember Hamilton's goals, his priorities. He was all about pragmatism. He knew that the U.S. was still young, vulnerable.
Not ready to pick another fight with Great Britain.
Exactly. Not economically, not militarily. So he sees this treaty, flaws and all, as a way to buy more time.
So a strategic compromise, like choose your battles.
Exactly. A classic example of Hamilton's approach. Get the best possible outcome, given the circumstances, even if it means making a deal that's not going to make everyone happy.
And it's interesting because even though this treaty was massively controversial at the time, it did kind of pave the way for a period of rapid growth and development in the U.S., didn't it?
It did. Trade expanded, the economy flourished. That vision of a strong, independent America that Hamilton had been pushing for, it started to become a reality.
Maybe not a perfect solution, but the Jay Treaty, along with the Proclamation of Neutrality, they really helped shape those early years of the American Republic.
Pivotal moments. They forced the nation to define its place in the world, grapple with these complicated questions about foreign policy, national interest, the role of government. Questions we're still grappling with, really. Well, let's just say it wasn't all smooth sailing from there.
Oh, I bet. Those pesky British again, right?
You know it. Even with the Jay Treaty, those tensions over impressment, those maritime rights, never really went away. Britain, they weren't too keen on the U.S. trading freely with their enemy, were they?
Understandable, but still.
Oh, absolutely. And, those forts might be gone, but that underlying desire to kind of meddle in American affairs, that lingered, let me tell you.
So it's like this weird, not quite war, but not really peace either, like a long, drawn-out Cold War with Great Britain.
That's a great way to put it, a very tense standoff. And, of course, it all eventually explodes, doesn't it? War of 1812.
Had to happen sometime, I guess. So much for avoiding conflict. Does this mean Hamilton's whole grand plan, this whole neutrality thing, was a failure?
Not necessarily. I mean, remember, Hamilton died in 1804, way before the war breaks out.
Right.
So we can only speculate on how he might have handled things. But the important point here is Hamilton wasn't advocating for isolationism, right? He knew the U.S. couldn't just hide from the world forever.
So more like what? A strategic withdrawal. Get strong at home first, then step onto that world stage.
You got it. Hamilton, he's envisioning this future where the U.S., after years of, economic growth, political stability, they could then choose their battles, engage on their own terms.
Instead of being reactive.
Exactly. And, it's interesting. The War of 1812, it wasn't part of the initial plan, obviously, but it kind of, in a way, it's part of that long process of the U.S. defining its role, right?
Finding their footing.
Exactly. And look, it wasn't pretty, but you got to start somewhere.
That's one way to look at it. It makes you think about those early decades of the U.S. after the Revolution. Talk about a crucible, The nation is literally being forged domestically and in terms of how it deals with the rest of the world.
Absolutely formative years, the seeds of so much, later conflicts, alliances, even economic systems, all planted during this time.
It all goes back to that core tension we talked about, doesn't it? America first versus global engagement. You can trace that straight back to these guys, Hamilton, Jefferson.
A debate that continues to this day, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we can't really know what Hamilton would make of the U.S. today, can we?
Nope, he'd probably have some very strong opinions, though.
Probably. But what we do know is that his ideas, right, this vision of a strong, independent nation, they still resonate.
No doubt about it. I mean, he was grappling with these foundational questions, the role of government, balance of power, the very nature of global engagement, things that are even more complicated now.
Way more complicated. But isn't that what's so great about history? It's not just, dates and names. It's about understanding these forces that have shaped our world. Forces that are still at play.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding those forces, learning from the past, we can make better decisions in the present, right?
Oh, I like that.
Gotta have hope.
I'm all about a little historical optimism. Now, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? Context, the controversies, the long-term consequences of Hamilton's push for neutrality really makes you think.
And that's the point, isn't it? To get people thinking.
It really is. So before we wrap up, anything that stood out to you from all this? Any big takeaways?
Honestly, it's the enduring relevance of this debate. I mean, sure, the world in 1793, very different from our world. But those fundamental questions about America's role, how much to engage, when to lead, when to hold back, those are still up for debate.
They really are. It's almost like each generation has to answer those questions for themselves.
In a way, yeah. And that's pretty powerful, don't you think?
It is. It's a lot of responsibility, too.
No pressure or anything.
Well, on that note, huge thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. It's been, enlightening, to say the least. We'll be back soon with another look at, some other fascinating historical moment. But until then, Keep asking those big questions and never stop learning.